Hi there, I'm Joe Todaro. Welcome back to Put Games to Work. Today we'll continue our exploration of game mechanics with a focus on the skill check mechanic. Also called the skill test mechanic, the skill check is a common and important feature in most role-playing games and in many cooperative games. Games that use the skill check mechanic typically involve players taking on the role of characters, where each character has their own unique strengths and weaknesses and abilities. Throughout the game, characters encounter obstacles and challenges on their way to completing the main goal of the game. As players encounter these challenges and obstacles, they must leverage the unique strengths of their characters to meet challenges and overcome these obstacles. Now, there are many different ways to implement a skill check mechanic. We don't have time to explore all the different ways that skill checks can work, so let's start with a single game and a single approach to the mechanic, so you can get an idea of how it works. This game is called Arkham Horror. In Arkham Horror, players take on the role of characters who work together to solve a mystery and prevent a supernatural disaster in the fictional town of Arkham, Massachusetts. Along the way to solving a game's mystery, characters encounter events, monsters, choices, and dilemmas. They must use their unique skills to overcome challenges, gain advantages, and avoid pitfalls. As you'll see, the skill check mechanic is a crucial mechanic, creating a context for interesting and challenging choices for players. Let's take a look. Okay, so here's a small setup of Arkham Horror. Now again, just like in our other games, we're not going to represent or try to build out every part of this game. We're just going to focus in on the specific part of the game that we're interested in this case, the skill check. So here are just a few components that will help us understand the skill check a little bit better. So first is we have this character card. Our character is Wendy Adams, and Wendy has some information about her as well as some abilities that we're going to get to in just a little bit here. Next, you'll notice that we have this area, what's called Miskatonic University. Miskatonic University is one neighborhood in the town of Arkham, Massachusetts. Now, you'll notice these grooves here, which represent, that would typically have streets that connect to other neighborhoods. So there's typically like 6, 7, or even 8 neighborhoods that the players need to, or the characters need to navigate their way through in order to discover or solve their mystery and win the game. So let's say that Wendy is here at the Orne Library, and we want to move her to the observatory. So we might do that on her turn. And so what happens is she moves to the observatory, and something happens, represented by the event deck. So let's turn over our card and see what happens. So this is what we got. Notice that we have the card divided into 3 sections: Observatory, Orne Library, and Science Building, representing the 3 areas of the Miskatonic University. So let's see what happens to Wendy at the observatory. You linger at the observatory after it closes, and you keep watch for any intruders. Notice this eye icon. If you pass, you spot a member of the Silver Twilight Lodge trying to sneak in, and you chase her away. You gain 1 clue from your neighborhood, and remove 1 doom from any space. If you fail, you fall asleep. Now, again, there's a lot happening here, but let's just focus in on this key thing. If you pass and if you fail. So this icon in parentheses represents a skill check that you can either pass or fail. And the icon represents observation, sometimes also called in other games dexterity. Now, notice Wendy has 5 different skills: lore, influence, observation, strength, and will. And each of these is represented by these icons. We just saw the observation icon, and each one has a skill level. So notice Wendy is only a 1 at influence, but she's 4 at observation, which means she's not very good at influencing people, but she's a very observant character. Now, the 4 means that in this case, we're going to roll 4 dice. If we were to test her influence, we'd only roll 1 die. Now, in Arkham Horror, a successful die roll is represented by rolling a 6 or a 5. If anything 1 through 4 is a failure. So let's see. She has only to get 1 success in observation in order to be successful at this check. So let's roll. And she's failed.
She did not get a 5 or a 6. So despite being really good at observation, she still failed the check. And in this case, what that means is she fell asleep. So she doesn't get all the good stuff that she might otherwise have gotten if she were able to stay awake. So let's try this roll again. Here we go. Now we got a 6. That represents success. I rolled a 6 or a 5, which means I passed that test this time, and so I would get all those things. So you can see how rolling 4 dice makes it more likely that you're going to pass the test, and that represents the fact that somebody's good at a particular skill, but it doesn't guarantee success, as opposed to a 1. If I were to roll a 1 die and try to get a 5 or a 6, that was a nice lucky roll, but in some cases, I'm not going to get it. So in the skill check, or the skill check or a skill test, you have these various abilities and represented by numeric values, and passing a test means rolling a certain number of dice relative to your particular ability, which increases the chances of success. So that's the core idea of the skill check and how it's represented in the game of Arkham Horror.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's break down the elements of a skill check. First, we have the idea of a skill type, like intelligence, dexterity, or strength. Next, we have the idea of a skill level, typically represented by a numerical value. The higher the value, the higher a character is in that strength type. Third, we have the idea of the check itself. In Arkham Horror, checking the skill involves rolling a number of dice equal to the character's skill level. So if a character is checking dexterity in a situation and their skill level is 4, they would roll 4 dice. And finally, we have the idea of a successful check. In Arkham Horror, each dice roll that results in a 5 or a 6 represents success. The more challenging the skill check, the more successful rolls the character would need to have. So those are the basic elements in a skill check. Let's take an example of how this might work in an instructional game. Let's say you're putting together training on how to manage a team of highly skilled employees. As part of that training, you're interested in designing an instructional game that simulates the experience of managing a team, assigning them tasks and project work that allow them to leverage their skills to be successful. Let's talk about what that game might look like and how it might work, so as to provide your player with the sorts of challenging choices in the game that they'd face in real life. Now, let's focus our instructional game on a specific context. Let's say a project management office, or PMO. So in this game, the player takes on the role of a manager or leader of a PMO who must assign project managers and project leaders to different projects of varying levels of complexity, risk, and difficulty. Now, let's think about the sorts of skills that a project manager or leader might have. A project manager or leader must be able to handle challenges that emerge during the life of a project that threaten the project's success. One such example that's pretty common is scope creep. Let's say a stakeholder on the project is notorious for making requests that threaten project scope. A skilled project manager might be good at negotiation, working with the stakeholder either to deflect or defer scope creep requests. So in our game, negotiation might be a character skill. Just as our character Wendy Adams had a score for dexterity, a project manager or leader might have a skill of negotiation, represented by a number. The higher the number, the more skilled that individual is at negotiation. So in our sample instructional game, we might have characters that represent leaders and project managers in our fictional PMO. These characters might each have a negotiation skill level. One character might be a seasoned veteran, skilled and experienced at managing stakeholder requests. This person would have a higher numerical value for their negotiation skill, while another character might be fairly unseasoned and inexperienced at managing stakeholders, and thus have a fairly low numeric value for negotiation. Let's push our example a little farther. Let's say that each project you assign a project manager in the game has its own event deck. Now, if you're unfamiliar with event decks, check out episodes 4 and 5, where we go into detail on event decks and their potential value in instructional games. Now, let's say one of the projects includes a stakeholder who is notorious for requesting scope increases. We could represent this tendency by adding multiple scope creep cards in the project's event deck, where the stakeholder makes a scope increase request. When such a card appears, the project leader must test their negotiation skills by rolling a certain number of dice to meet the challenge. If the project manager negotiates successfully, the request is deferred or managed appropriately, without increasing scope. If the project manager fails to negotiate the request without an increase in scope, then the project takes on more risk. The conditions of the game change to represent the project manager's success or failure in that event. Now, that brings us to the value that dice rolls can provide in your instructional games. Dice rolls represent the real-world conditions that are outside of your control. Even a highly skilled negotiator might meet a stiff negotiation challenge and fail to come through. That failure represents a setback or risk to the project that must be managed. Elements of chance, like dice rolls, introduce an element of complexity and unknown that represent how real life works. I hope this example gives you an idea of how the skill check mechanic might be valuable in instructional contexts. Consider situations where a player is guiding a team of characters in the game, like a team manager, supporting a team of project leaders or project managers. As they journey through the game towards the game's main goal, they encounter challenges that will test their skills, with no guarantee they'll be successful. If they're unsuccessful, what's the result? And how will the players support the characters to overcome a failure or setback and achieve the overall goal of the game? And finally, consider how nicely the skill check pairs with the event deck. Events emerge that test skills, and the results of these tests alter the course of the game, for better or for worse. Consider when to modify the level of challenge of the skill, adding or subtracting dice to the skill check to make the test more or less difficult, or increase the number of successful rolls needed to be successful. How might that represent different levels of challenge, even for skilled characters? In an upcoming video, we'll be engaging in our first prototyping session. We'll leverage the skill check, the event deck, and perhaps one or two more mechanics to prototype an instructional game. So if this still feels a little bit abstract, the prototyping session should make it feel a bit more concrete. In the meantime, Arkham Horror represents only one of many approaches to the skill check mechanic. I highly recommend you try out games that include the skill check mechanic to get an idea for how it might work. For seasoned gamers out there, I'd be grateful if you added a recommendation or two of your favorite accessible games that use the skill check mechanic. I'll do the same. Thank you very much for your time today. We'll see you next time.